So imagine you're sitting at a diner, right? You're having coffee with a business contact, you get to talking, and you just casually agree to buy their multi-million-dollar company.
Which happens all the time, honestly.
Right, yeah. And you just grab a pen, write down the basic terms on some greasy paper napkin, sign your name at the bottom, and just, shove it into your jeans pocket.
A classic move.
Exactly. But then you walk out of the diner, go home, and you accidentally wash those jeans, so the napkin is just completely destroyed in the laundry. Pulp.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And then a week later, the other person tries to back out of the sale. So the question is, does that contract still exist, even though the only proof is literally pulp in your washing machine?
Well, surprisingly enough, the legal system says yes. It absolutely does.
Which is crazy to me. And welcome to today's deep dive, by the way.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a perfect scenario to start with, I think, because it really highlights the massive gap between what we assume the law requires and how the law actually functions in the real world.
Yeah, for sure.
We tend to assume every binding agreement requires, like, a leather-bound document signed in triplicate by a notary. But the reality of how society functions is just completely different.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because our mission today is to decode this very famous, very old legal concept called the Statute of Frauds. And I think we need to start with the baseline rule of life here, which is that oral spoken contracts are totally valid.
Yes, exactly. That is the default.
Right. If I promise to pay you $50 to mow my lawn, and you say yes, we have a legally binding contract. So frictionless commerce is the default setting for the world.
Right, you don't need a contract for every little thing.
Exactly. But the statute of frauds is this massive exception to that rule. It's basically a specific list of high-stakes scenarios where a court will just flat out refuse to help you unless you have the deal in writing.
Yeah, I like to think of the statute of frauds like two-factor authentication for the legal system.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, like when you use an app on your phone for daily tasks, it just lets you in. But the moment you try to do something drastic like change your password, transfer your life savings, delete your account, the system stops you.
It wants to make sure it's really you.
Exactly. It demands a secondary code to verify it. And the legal system operates the exact same way. It trusts your word for everyday things, but for these massive, life-altering commitments, it demands that secondary verification. It wants to see the receipts.
Okay, so before we get to the specific life events that trigger this legal two-factor authentication, I feel like we really need to understand what the law actually means by in writing. Because based on that diner napkin scenario, the law's definition of a writing is incredibly broad.
Oh, it is incredibly broad. The law really does not care about the formality of the paper.
It doesn't have to say contract at the top.
Not at all. It doesn't need to be drafted by an attorney. A writing can be a receipt, a casual letter, or honestly, even a messy chain of completely separate emails or text messages.
Wait, really? Just a bunch of texts?
Yep. The only requirement for a multi-document deal like that is that the pieces of correspondence clearly reference each other, so a judge can piece the puzzle together.
Oh, I see.
The writing just has to outline the essential elements, like who is involved and what exactly is being exchanged.
And here's where I want to jump in regarding that destroyed napkin, actually. Because in the sources we reviewed, there's this very specific phrase used. It says, the document only needs to be signed by the party to be charged.
All right, the party to be charged.
Which, if we translate that out of legalese, it just means the person who is trying to run away from the deal. Right?
Yes, and that is a critical mechanism. If you and I make a deal, and I am the one trying to back out, you only need to produce a document that has my signature on it.
Okay.
Your signature is entirely irrelevant in that moment because you aren't the one disputing the agreement. You're the one trying to enforce it.
That makes sense.
And the thing that trips most people up here is that this document doesn't even need to be delivered to you.
Wait, hold on. So let me get this straight. If we shake hands on a deal, and I go home and write a letter to my mother saying, hey, Mom, I just agreed to buy this guy's car for $10,000, and I sign that letter, but I never mail it.
Okay.
It just sits on my desk. If you somehow get your hands on that unsent letter, you can use it to force me to buy the car.
You are legally bound. Absolutely.
That is wild.
It is, but the law is just looking for a footprint. Something that proves the agreement actually happened. It really doesn't matter who you intended that footprint for.
Wow.
The fact that you admitted to the deal in writing and you signed it, well, that's enough to satisfy the court that you aren't being framed by some fake oral contract.
Okay, and going back to the laundry.
Right. If that letter or your diner napkin gets thrown in the laundry or shredded, the underlying contract doesn't vanish.
Yeah.
You just have to bring in oral evidence, like, say, a waitress who saw you signing the napkin to prove that the footprint used to exist.
Okay, so synthesizing this for you, the listener, in plain English. Writing just means there is some tangible proof the deal existed, and it bears the signature, or even just the name, of the person trying to break the deal. It
Exactly.
doesn't need to be formal, it doesn't need to be handed to the other person, and if it gets destroyed, you can still enforce the deal if you can prove the paper was real. The court just wants some kind of physical anchor before they start forcing people to hand over money.
Which leads us perfectly into exactly when the law demands this physical anchor. Because, I mean, you don't want to carry a notepad around for every coffee run or a casual favor.
Right. That would be exhausting.
Exactly. You just need to know the specific triggers.
Mm-hmm.
And law students actually memorize a framework for this using an acronym. It's MSLOU.
MSLOU.
Right.
MSLOU. Okay, since we know the statute of frauds acts like two-factor authentication, it stands to reason that MSLOU represents like the highest stakes decisions a human being can make.
They absolutely do.
So we are talking about marriage, suretyships, land, deals lasting over 1 year, and the UCC, which handles physical goods over $500.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the underlying psychology of the court becomes very clear here. These 5 categories all represent permanent.
Permanence. Okay.
Right. They are deals that permanently alter your family structure, permanently attach you to someone else's debts, permanently transfer real estate, lock up years of your time, or move significant amounts of expensive inventory.
Oh, big deals.
The biggest. The law assumes that people do not make these kinds of massive life-altering decisions lightly. Therefore, if someone claims you casually promised them your house, the court demands proof to prevent massive fraud.
Okay, let's pull apart these categories to see how they actually function, starting with the first 3: marriage, suretyships, and land. Let's start with marriage. Let's say I ask my partner to marry me, and they say yes, we just made a mutual oral promise. Is the law going to invalidate my engagement because I didn't propose with a signed document?
No. The law actually carves out a specific exception for love, which is nice. Mutual promises to marry each other do not require a writing.
Oh, good. That would ruin the romance.
It really would. Where the statute of frauds steps in is when a contract is made in consideration of marriage.
Meaning what exactly?
This means an agreement where a financial incentive or property is being exchanged as the literal price for the marriage.
Oh, okay. So we were talking about prenuptial agreements or situations where someone says, I will transfer my stock portfolio to you if you marry me.
Precisely. When marriage becomes a transactional exchange of assets, the risk of fraud skyrockets. The court doesn't want to untangle whether someone verbally promised $1 million during a romantic dinner, so they require those specific property for marriage deals to be documented.
That makes total sense. All right, that brings us to suretyships. Now, in simple English, a suretyship is just guaranteeing someone else's debt, right? We usually call it co-signing.
Yep, co-signing is the most common example.
So if my friend wants to start a business and I promise to cover his loan if he fails, I am acting as the surety.
Exactly. It's a 3-party triangle. You have the principal, who is your friend, borrowing the money. You have the creditor, usually a bank, giving the money. And you have the surety, which is you providing the safety net.
Okay, got it.
The rule states that a promise to answer for the debt of another must be in writing. But there's a massive trap here regarding who you actually make the promise to.
Okay, so what does this all mean for my conversation with my friend? If I pull him aside and say, hey man, don't worry, I'll pay the bank if your business goes under, does that specific conversation need to be written down?
No, and this is where the mechanism is really fascinating.
Right.
A verbal promise to your friend is entirely valid and outside the statute of frauds.
Really?
Yeah. You can socially promise to bail him out all day long. But if you walk into the bank and try to make that same durable promise to the loan officer, it is completely unenforceable.
Oh, I see.
The promise must be made in writing to the creditor. The bank needs documentary evidence to assess their financial risk. They cannot underwrite a loan based on a buddy's verbal goodwill.
That is a brilliant distinction. So a promise to a friend is a social obligation, but a promise to a bank is a financial instrument. Okay, let's look at the third piece of this heavy hitter trio, land. The rule is that any contract to buy, sell, or transfer an interest in real estate must be in writing.
And we have to be careful here to separate the contract from the deed itself.
What's the difference?
Well, the actual physical handover of the property conveying the deed has its own incredibly strict set of property laws. The statute of frauds governs the vulnerable period before that happens.
Oh, the initial agreement.
Right. It governs the moment where you say, I promise to buy your house next month. And furthermore, this rule applies to more than just buying and selling. It covers long-term leases, or like granting someone an easement to use your land, provided those agreements last longer than 1 year.
Because it's land, it's permanent.
Exactly. Land is finite, it is unique, and it is usually the most expensive thing a person will ever buy. So the court treats it with absolute paranoia.
So looking at these first three, marriage, debt, and land, it feels like the common thread really is that permanence. To recap in plain English, the court is basically saying, if this decision is going to permanently alter your assets, your credit score, or where you live, we are not taking your word for it. You need a writing.
That is the exact philosophy. Which brings us to the final two letters of the framework, the O and the U. And these govern the two resources that drive the entire economy, time and money.
Let's start with time. The O stands for the 1-year provision. So the sources state that a contract needs a writing if it cannot be performed within 1 year from the day after it's made.
That's the rule.
But wait, hold on. I want to test the boundaries of this. Let's do an analogy.
Let's hear it.
What if I hire you to build an exact, full-scale, functioning replica of the Titanic? Now, the original ship took 3 years to build with thousands of workers, and we just shake hands on this deal in my driveway. Are you telling me that because it's a massive multi-year project, our handshake is legally useless?
Actually, no. Your handshake is legally binding. The contract does not need to be in writing.
Wait, how does that make any sense? It will obviously take more than a year to build the Titanic.
Because the legal test isn't whether finishing the project in a year is realistic or likely or even highly probable. The test is whether it is mathematically and physically impossible.
Impossible.
Yes. Theoretically, if you threw infinite billions of dollars, infinite resources, and 2 million workers at the project, you could physically assemble a replica of the Titanic in 364 days.
Oh my gosh.
Right. Because it is theoretically possible to finish in under a year, the law says it does not strictly fall under the statute of frauds. Therefore, an oral contract to build the Titanic is totally valid.
My mind is blown. The law is looking at strict impossibility, not common sense.
Well, it forces clarity. Now, if your oral contract explicitly stated, you will build the Titanic, and you are required to stretch the work out for exactly 3 years, then the terms themselves make it impossible to finish in 1 year.
Got it.
Only then does it demand a writing. And the reason this rigid 1-year rule exists is memory. Human memory is terrible. The court does not want to adjudicate a he said, she said dispute about a casual conversation that happened 36 months ago.
That makes perfect sense. Time degrades evidence. So let's pivot to money, which is the U in MSLOU. This stands for the UCC, or the Uniform Commercial Code. It's essentially the operating system for American business deals. The rule is that a contract for the sale of physical goods for $500 or more must be in writing.
And notice the distinction there. Physical goods, not services, not an architect's consulting fee, but tangible items, laptops, lumber, machinery. And when dealing with physical goods over that $500 threshold, the writing requirements have a very specific quirk. The document must indicate a deal was made, it must identify the parties, but crucially, it must contain a quantity term.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Why is quantity the magic word? Like, why not the price?
Because judges can figure out the price of something, but they cannot read your mind.
What do you mean?
If you and I have a messy written contract for lumber, and we forgot to write down the price, the judge can just look at the market rate for lumber on that specific Tuesday and assign a fair price.
Oh, sure.
But a judge has absolutely no way of knowing whether you intended to buy 10 planks of wood or 10,000 planks of wood. Quantity is the one thing the court cannot deduce from outside evidence.
So quantity is king. And what if you make a typo? Say I meant to order 1,000 laptops, but I accidentally typed 100 on the purchase order.
Well, the contract is still valid, but the court will brutally cap you at whatever quantity is written on the page. You are legally capped at 100 laptops. The court will not allow oral testimony to contradict the written quantity.
Wow. So if we do our simple English recap and tie the time and money rules together, if your deal's timeline defies the laws of physics to finish in under a year, or if you are buying a large amount of physical stuff over $500, you need to leave a paper trail.
Exactly.
But, having reviewed all these strict rules, the legal system seems incredibly rigid. What happens if you already shook hands on a deal, you spent months doing the work, and then halfway through you realize you forgot to draft a contract? Can the other person just walk away and leave you empty-handed?
What's fascinating here is how the law pivots when fairness is really on the line. The entire purpose of the statute of frauds is to prevent people from fabricating fake oral contracts. But a piece of paper isn't the only way to prove a deal is real.
What's the other way?
Actions. If your physical actions in the real world clearly demonstrate that a contract existed, the courts will step in. Actions replace the signature.
Ah, show, don't tell. That is a brilliant alternative to the two-factor authentication. Let's run through these action-based exceptions, starting back with guaranteeing a debt. When can you verbally guarantee a loan?
There's a vital loophole called the main purpose exception. If you guarantee someone's debt purely to benefit your own wallet, an oral promise is binding.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Imagine you run a factory and your main parts supplier is about to go bankrupt. You verbally promise the bank you will cover the supplier's loan so they can stay open. You aren't doing this out of the goodness of your heart, right? Your main purpose is to keep your own assembly line running.
Self-interest.
Exactly. Because it is a selfish business move, the court views the oral promise as highly credible and enforces it.
Okay, what about land? Obviously, paying a down payment isn't enough to prove a whole house was sold. How do your actions prove a real estate deal?
Through a doctrine called part performance. Handing over cash isn't enough because money changes hands for a million different reasons.
Right.
But if you pay a portion of the price and you physically move onto the property and you make substantial improvements like pouring a concrete foundation for a new garage, the oral contract becomes enforceable.
Wow. Okay.
Because no sane person builds a garage on a stranger's lawn unless there was a legitimate agreement to buy the property. The act of pouring concrete is louder than any signature.
You literally cemented the deal.
I see what you did there.
I had to. Okay, what about the UCC? If I verbally order 1,000 custom t-shirts with my podcast logo printed all over them, and they cost way more than $500, I didn't sign anything, can I just cancel the order while they are printing them?
You cannot. This is the exception for specially manufactured goods. Once the printer makes a substantial start on manufacturing those t-shirts, you are locked in.
Even without a signature?
Even without it. Those shirts are entirely useless to any other buyer on the planet. Nobody else wants your logo. The fact that the factory retooled its machines to print your specific logo is absolute proof that an agreement was made. Additionally, if you have already received the goods and accepted them or paid for them and the payment was accepted, the exchange of items acts as the proof.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, there's one more UCC exception that really stood out regarding how businesses communicate with each other. The merchant rule.
Yes, the merchant rule. If both parties are merchants, meaning they're businesses that regularly deal in these goods, the rules of the game change to match the speed of commerce.
Okay.
If one business sends a written confirmation of a verbal deal, like an invoice or an email, the receiving business has 10 days to object in writing. If they read the email and just ignore it, they're legally bound by the terms in that document, even though they never signed it.
That is terrifying, but highly efficient. So if I am a supplier and I email a retailer saying, hey, confirming our handshake for 10,000 widgets, and the retailer just archives the email without replying, their silence is treated as a legally binding signature.
Exactly, because in the fast-paced world of merchants, silence in the face of a confirmation is assumed to be acceptance. It forces businesses to actively manage their communications.
Wow. So doing our final plain English recap here to synthesize these exceptions. The law is incredibly practical. It demands a writing for major life events to avoid fraud. But if you have already started doing custom manufacturing or pouring concrete on a new property or operating in your own economic self-interest, the court looks at your behavior and says, we don't need a napkin to know this deal was real.
That is the perfect way to look at it. The law wants evidence, but it recognizes that human behavior can be just as undeniable as ink on a page.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. And for you listening, remember, while a firm handshake is a great way to establish trust, when you are dealing with the massive life events of MS-LOU marriage, suretyships, land, deals over 1 year, and goods over $500, you need to grab a pen, leave a footprint.
And remember that footprint doesn't have to be a formal contract. Just get the essential terms into some kind of tangible format.
Yeah. And that actually brings up a modern dilemma I want to leave you with, connecting everything we just talked about to the phone sitting in your pocket right now.
Right.
Think about how many casual emails, DMs, text messages, or Slack threads you fire off every single day at work or in your personal life.
It's a lot.
It's a ton. And we just learned that the law says a writing doesn't need to be formal. It doesn't need to be officially delivered. It can be pieced together from a messy chain of digital correspondence. And all it needs is your name typed at the bottom or even a digital signature block you forgot was turned on. So, knowing what you know now about how broadly the courts view this, how many accidental, legally binding contracts are you typing out on your phone while waiting in line for coffee, completely unaware that you are satisfying the statute of frauds? Think about that the next time you hit send.